Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello and welcome to The Money Factor. I'm Richard Naylor, your host. Our guest today is Patrick Mackrell. He's President and CEO of New York Business Development Corporation. That organization helps provide capital to small businesses and so very much fits the theme of our show. I want to welcome him to the show and very happy he's here. Patrick, thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.
You usually start out by trying to find out something about the person behind the position. It could be about your background as far back or as little far back as you want to go, or just what brought you to the job.
Certainly the most formative part of my life is the time that I spent in the Marine Corps. I spent enlisted in the Marine Corps following college and went through an officer program and ultimately law school in the Marine Corps as well.
Oh.
So I was involved in one form or another from the Marine Corps from 1971 to 1986 when I came back to this area. So I'd say that was probably the most significant period in my life in terms of influences on my style, my management style, and how I deal with issues and challenges at our company.
Well, it's certainly where strategy makes a huge difference, life and death, and you really got to take care of little details.
Well, I never had a shot fired at me in anger, but other than that, the issues certainly that you face are significant, and it teaches you how to prioritize and emphasize what's important and what's right.
How did you get to New York Business Development Corporation?
Yeah, I'm an attorney by education, and I was one of my clients. I was with a law firm which was then Lemery Mackrell Greisler. It's now Lemery Greisler. I was with that law firm, and one of my clients was New York Business Development Corporation. And in the process of their transition planning, I was approached by the company to consider coming on board and perhaps sort of vetting for the job. Certainly no guarantees, but it seemed like a tremendous challenge to me to make a transition from a bank lawyer to a banker. And I was given that opportunity, and I went with the company in 2001, and initially as a senior vice president and general counsel. Ultimately, and moved on from that to executive vice president and general counsel, then executive vice president, chief operating officer, and then president a little over 2 years ago.
Fantastic.
When my predecessor retired. So it's quite a change.
And it's been doing very well. But first, let's get into what is it. I sometimes talk to people from New York State, this or that.
Right.
And it took me a few sentences to stop saying New York S. It's New York Business Development Corporation.
Yeah, it's the New York is designed to identify the state, not the government, certainly. And it is a private company. It's owned by shareholders. It's a private, for-profit company. It pays state and federal income taxes. The idea was formed in 1955. Wow. And what's unusual about it is it was formed pursuant to a special act of the New York State Legislature. There is a section of the banking law called New York Business Development Corporation. And we were organized under that section. And the idea at that time was the legislature and the governor at that time recognized that small businesses were the engine of the economy, that small businesses needed capital to thrive and grow. That small businesses could create jobs and economic opportunity across New York State. But they also realized that banks on their own were unwilling or would be unlikely to make significant capital investments or loans available to small businesses at that time that would be startups or early stages or businesses that had uneven financial performance historically. So the idea of the legislation at that point was to allow banks to form a consortium to share risk. So with the idea that the banks would be, as a consortium, would be willing to share risk in credits that they would not be willing to take individually. And the reason the legislation was so important is because a loan from a bank to our company, which would be necessary to make, ultimately for us to make the loans, were prohibited by state statute because most of the banks in New York were savings banks or thrifts, and they couldn't make commercial loans in
I see.
1955.
So they would loan you the money,
So
and
that-
you would then.
Exactly so. Our initial capital was very modest. I mean, the actual investment by our shareholders was modest. What was significant and remains so is the loans that they make to us, so that we can then make credit decisions and reloan that. At the outset, the theory was if we lost money, the banks would share in the loss. We never did default on a loan. We've paid every loan back that we've gotten from the banks, and we now have a very significant equity position in our company and a very significant liquidity in terms of our access to lines of credit across the state.
That's kind of interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I was impressed by the date, the 1950s. That seems, I know, okay, it was 50-something years ago, but it was only, what, 10 years after World War II, or less?
It was only 10 years after World War II. It was only about 2 years after the United States Small Business Administration was formed. So it was a very, it was a time where we were focusing on the opportunities that small business afforded to people who now had returned from World War II. They had completed, that period of time, they had completed their college education. They were looking to move on and start businesses, and tremendous opportunities were taking place then. So it was quite a novel idea. Our legislation talks about making loans to women-owned and minority businesses, and that's a very significant and insightful, move.
That's truly surprising that
in terms of
that would be there
of dealing with those issues.
And I think compared to today, then it's also the second thing that's interesting about it is nothing is new. Although I guess I'm wrong because it was new in the 50s. That was really the beginning of some of these ideas.
Very much so.
Okay.
Yeah, very much so.
Well, let's talk a little about your mission. It's, of course, wrapped into what you just said, and I guess if we fully understood what you just said, we would be done. But I think we want to make it a little more explicit than that.
Well, if you fully understood it based on that explanation, you'd be in a distinct minority, I will tell you, because we explain our job, our mission, frequently, even to our shareholders and our frequent participants. The root of our mission is to make capital accessible to small businesses, where conventional banking is not able to fully respond to that request, and that's the essence of it. I mean, we're not competing for the loans with our banks. We believe that small businesses are well served by a traditional banking relationship. Excuse me. Because they need checking accounts, they need lines of credit, they need home mortgages, they need all the services that banks can provide and should provide customers. What sometimes the banks are not able to do using the conventional underwriting standards is to make a loan to a startup or an early stage business or a business that may have historically done very well, but they're going through either a major period of expansion or they had perhaps an uneven financial performance in the recent years. In those cases, what we try to do is to get involved in that situation. Usually the bank brings us in. More than 90% of what we do, we're brought in by our partner, one of our partner banks. And as you can see from our annual report, we have over 135 partner banks, and we had 155 or so last year. We gained 4, and we ended up at 135, which could give you an idea of the consolidation of banking in New York.
Oh, I see.
We didn't lose any banks. They just shrunk in terms of the names by consolidation.
I didn't get it.
But the idea is that the bank will identify a credit, an opportunity, a small business loan request, that they are comfortable with a lot of things about the credit, and they really, they want to say yes, but they just can't. It's just below the band.
Kind of a gray area.
Yeah, they're in a band below where they would, clearly fall into either a credit scored approval, which is becoming increasingly popular, or even traditional underwriting would point to difficulties in the credit. So basically, if the bank is clearly going to say, no, this is not something we're going to do, we're probably going to take a very similar approach to it, because you do have to have some ability to repay. You have to have the character, credibility to make sure that this can work.
And you wouldn't be doing the business a favor if you took on something that really wasn't going to succeed.
Absolutely not. And sometimes those are difficult things that you have to tell somebody that, based on our experience, as just wanting it to happen. And, we're not doubting your sincerity or your genuineness or your commitment to this, but it just doesn't make sense the way it's proposed. And we'll help shape that. I mean, we'll send them to, there's any number of financial counseling services that are available free. We're big fans of the small business development centers that are funded by the SBA and located at various universities across the state. They're a very effective tool for small businesses. But getting back to how we work, the bank will refer that credit to us. And our goal is to have a situation where the bank and our company will participate in the loan.
Okay.
So if you have, say, a $500,000 credit application, the bank would say, this is something that we're pretty comfortable with a lot of things about this credit, but we want to mitigate our exposure, mitigate our risk of loss in the event of default. So they would bring us in. Now, we would do one or two things. In the first instance, we might simply say, okay, we will participate with you, Bank X, in this loan. So, we'll give the borrower $500,000, you'll take $250,000, and we'll take $250,000. So
they've reduced their risk by 50%.
Exactly so. And the bank would retain all of the traditional banking relationships. They'd retain the deposit accounts. They'd retain all of those indicia of banking, because we don't do that type of, we do term lending for business owners. Okay.
In other words, you have a fixed period of time.
We have a fixed period of time
back.
of repayment, and we don't advance and re-advance like you would under a line of credit.
Okay.
We'll make a loan for $250,000, and we'll expect that to be repaid over a certain period of time at a stated interest rate.
Right.
Sometimes our participation in the loan may not be enough to mitigate the risk. Sometimes we may have to seek government guarantees to further mitigate the risk. And we do that by seeking SBA guarantees of Small Business Administration guarantees of that obligation.
So that's really a question of a lack of money, or why wouldn't you be able to then participate without more funds? Or is
It's not the funds that the SBA provides you. It's the insurance or the insulation in risk of loss. I mean,
okay.
It would still be using that same $500,000 example. If our mere participation in the credit was not enough to, we're all bankers. I mean, I'm probably the least experienced person in terms of banking in our place. We got a very talented credit crew there, and if we did not feel that just lopping it down to $250 each was enough, and rarely is that enough, because these credits tend to be challenging issues.
Okay.
Otherwise, the banks would do them themselves. So we would seek an SBA guarantee, for instance. On a $500,000 loan, you could apply for a 75% SBA guarantee. So your exposure,
fantastic, yeah.
is $125,000 on a $500,000 loan, and you whack that in half, and you get to, $62,500 if my math is right in my head. Exposure for the bank and NYBDC.
And now that loan interest rate looks pretty good relative to that risk.
Well, it's still, we have money still out on the street. We're still borrowing $250,000 from our sources of credit. We're still lending them $250. They're still paying us back $250. The only time the SBA guarantee comes in, if for some reason the borrower is unable to repay the loan,
right? And
if we go through the collection process, liquidating the collateral, the SBA will come in and pay us then 75% of our net loss. So. The purpose of the SBA guarantees are to encourage banks to make loans, banks and others to make loans to small businesses.
So it's kind of the government equivalent of what you're doing.
It's similar to what we do, although there has to be a delivery vehicle for that. I mean, they don't do it. It's not self-creating. You have to make application, you have to monitor it, you have to follow.
So they have their own role, and
they have their own role, and a lot of times our role with the bank is to control the SBA relationship. We're SBA experts. We know what qualifies and what doesn't qualify. We do it each day, every day, all day. Whereas banks may be, one day a banker may be doing a multi-million-dollar apartment job, and the next day may be doing a relatively smaller project, but still maybe not owner-occupied. They're not small business concentrations in SBA loans as we are in the margin, I'm not going to say the marginal borrowers, but it's the marginal credit situations.
Right.
That's our bread and butter
Right.
is trying to structure and proper credit, situations for these borrowers that might fall outside the traditional banking radar screen.
And yet, I guess a couple points. The first one is just a point, and then a question. You're making money. You're a stock company, and you're making money. And I guess the implication there is that, okay, these were deemed risky loans, but in a way, the way you've done it, they're not.
Well, they're still risky loans, but we think we make good credit decisions.
Doing something right.
We think we make good collateral decisions. We think we adequately collateral them. And the bottom line, we're making loans to good and decent people who are working hard to repay the loan. No one wants their business to succeed more than they do. I mean, we're cheering for them all the time. We're restructuring all the time, and the credits that need it. But we've had, knock on wood, we've had a good run. We've been able to make loans. We make them at very affordable interest rates. I mean, we don't mark the rate up really to the risk in some cases. We try to give a fixed rate loan at the lowest level that will give us an operating return. And I think also importantly, although we're a stock company and a privately owned company, year after year after year, our stockholders have not taken a dividend. We distribute a dividend relatively infrequently to our shareholders. It's relatively modest. And they're all encouraging, and I would say more than a handful of our shareholders, and that's individuals, we have a few individuals, but institutions, send us back the check and say, reinvest it in the company. This year, Bank of America shareholders sent us back the check and said, reinvest it in the company.
Nice.
HSBC said, send us back the check. At the same time, we had small community banks send back the check and reinvest it in the company. And the checks weren't large checks, but it was very rewarding for us to see the commitment across New York State. I mean, we have the money center banks, the J.P. Morgan Chases, the Citibanks, the Bank of America as members, and we have the small one-branch banks throughout New York State as members.
I noticed that. I was impressed.
And
I was looking around Berkshire.
Incredible variety of banks. We have banks that are Chinese banks in New York
Citibank,
City.
Deutsche Bank, I saw that.
Yeah, Israel Discount Bank, but you have Champlain National Bank, and you have Solvay Bank and Pathfinder Bank and Alliance Bank, and many banks that we in this area haven't heard of. But
which leads me into a question: if a small business person wants a loan, assuming that they're not a lock, that they've got such good credit and they could take it anywhere and they know they're going to get money. If they take it to a bank that works with you and they are knowledgeable about this option, which includes the SBA, they do seem to have an advantage because there's a program there where if they fall into this band, somebody can say, this might be a good investment for...
Right. Well, it's a tremendous, that part is the teamwork that we enjoy and the relationships that we enjoy with our member banks. Because we're committed to being non-competitive with them, and we're not, and that's one of our, we have 2 or 3 major philosophical bright lines in our company, and one is don't compete with the banks because we work better in partnership. We need to have, our role initially is to make sure that we're at that bank telling these loan officers what we can do with the credits that they would otherwise maybe take a pass on.
Right, and since a bank has referred the customer to you,
right.
Obviously, you're not competing with that bank.
We're not competing with the bank, and we've done our job. If that's how it works, we've done our educational job with the banks, because that means we've been out there meeting with them and telling them what we can do, and then the right situation comes along, and then they refer it to us. Then the challenge is for us, because then we have to do what we said we could do,
right.
And we have to deliver what we said we could deliver, and we have to make the SBA bureaucracy seamless, painless, and responsive.
And I saw in
them.
one case quickly.
And quickly, and sometimes slowly. Sometimes, if you looked at our most recent annual report, which you did, there was one project in there with Mailpack Bank where the key was moving quickly.
I think 5 days you had the first part of it done.
Correct.
And then maybe a week later you had the second part done.
Correct, and that was a very substantial project. The other aspect was, if you saw a project we did in Wellsville with Key Bank,
Yes.
and the key there was patience, because the borrower was having a difficulty negotiating.
But I didn't notice that.
It was negotiating the contract to buy this facility, which would allow them to make a substantial expansion of a manufacturing facility in New York State.
Multi-thousands, that was the train?
No, that wasn't the train. That was a different loan. This was the Northern Lights Candle Company.
Oh, right, yes, yes.
Which allowed them, and it's a very substantial employer. It's manufacturing in New York State, and the key there was...
And huge growth over there.
Huge growth, and that we were patient enough. And so one case in the annual report that we highlight is our speed, and the other was highlight our patience and are willing to sit back and let the deal take the shape that the owners and the bankers, importantly, wanted to take for the benefit of the borrower.
In many cases, I've wondered, okay, now how does somebody get in touch with the guest? How does someone get in? But it looks like in this case, if someone is watching, the relevance is to understand what you do, because they would probably go to their own bank, whichever one they preferred, and from there they would be referred to you.
That's in the ideal scenario. We do not market generally to borrowers, for instance. We don't market to real estate brokers or other folks. Our focus of our marketing is to banks, to let them know when you have a small business borrower that you can't accommodate the way you would a traditional credit in your bank. Bring us in on it. See if we can chat back and forth and structure something that makes sense. And we do that with, certainly the SBA 7A or with our straight participation. But one of the things we haven't touched on, though, is another SBA program that is a pretty phenomenal program, the SBA 504.
I'm glad you brought it up.
Loan program, which
I needed
is very
a little
significant.
help, I think.
Yeah. It's actually about 75% of what we do now is in the 504 loan program.
I'm hoping you explain that a little bit, what that program is.
The loan program is the SBA made a determination in the late 70s, early 80s, that one of the ways to develop the economy was to facilitate the acquisition of fixed assets by businesses, because if you were able to do that, that would lead to the growth of jobs opportunity and economic development. So the first question is, what is fixed assets for this? Fixed assets would be machinery, equipment, and real estate.
Okay.
You're operating your major tangible assets in your business.
Now, would that include a train, or would it?
It might include a train.
Good,
we've done trains. We've done barges. We've done tugboats.
Wow.
We've done the Pirates of the Caribbean. We financed that with a 504 loan. The boat that you saw on the Disney feature there. That's the HMS Bounty. It's called. It's home ported out of Long Island.
Beautiful.
We've done Affairs Afloat, which is a ship tied up to the pier in Manhattan. That's a catering facility. We've done golf domes. Everything that you might imagine that could be financed as a major business asset. We've done them. And the idea there is the SBA will allow, whereas traditional financing tends to support a proposition where the borrower has to put in 25% down, to buy a commercial building, for instance. This program will finance 90% of the purchase price of the asset.
So if you've got a good plan, it really makes it much easier.
And the idea is that if the SBA will help you finance a good chunk of that asset, that means that the money that you would otherwise have to put into the bricks and mortar in the building, you now have available for working capital. And you can use that working capital to buy inventory, to buy equipment, to market, to train your employees, to do all sorts of different things that will help the business sustain and grow. And in fact, one of the aspects of that loan program is you have to have a jobs creation component of the program. So, recently we did a deal in Long Island, a $4 million printing concern that had lost its lease in Manhattan, and its choice was to go to Long Island or to go to New Jersey. We put $4 million in a 504 that allowed them to acquire a facility in Long Island City. Now, the way the 504 works is the bank would do the first 50% of the loan.
Okay.
Okay, so the bank has a first mortgage for 50%. That obviously is very attractive to the bank because they've got a prior lien on the collateral, so they're in a very good position.
And it's a big collateral loan anyway.
Tends to be big, so they'll have a 50% lien. We would come in the SBA, we would come in representing the SBA and take a second lien for up to 40% of the project cost. The borrower then has to put in 10% equity. Huge benefit to the borrower.
Right. And the bank can't really lose.
The bank is in a tough position. As long as we've been doing this, and to put us in perspective, we're by far the largest 504 company in the United States, in New York. We're ranked 7th nationally of the 270 development companies.
That's
so
pretty
we've
good
got an
too.
office in Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, Albany, New York City, and Melville, Long Island. It's a very big deal for these SBA loans to get involved in a property. Right now, the fixed rate for those SBA loans is almost laughable. It's so terrific. 6.46% fixed for 20 years.
Wow.
And traditionally, our rates are better. The 504 rates for the second mortgage is better than the bank mortgage because our rates are full faith and credit of the United States government. So it's almost at a bond pricing.
You can't really
bond
lose.
pricing rate. So it's a very effective program. It's been phenomenally effective in promoting jobs growth in New York State. Last year, in that program, we created over 4,500 jobs in New York.
How is that kind of sorted out? What kind of, obviously you said they have to be capital intensive.
May not be. I mean, it could be our lowest loan is $50,000. I mean, I gave you the $4 million
it's not
loan,
the
but
size.
we approved a loan today, 504 loan. We approved a loan for a small deli convenience store in the area where the whole package is less than $300,000 or $400,000. I don't remember the exact number, but the important part is that 40% of that debt is going to be repaid over 20 years.
So
which is a long term, and it's going to be paid at a very
kind of thing governments can do.
Very modest interest rate, and that frees up cash flow in the short term to sustain the business. And by not having to put the huge equity contribution down at the beginning, they have working capital, so the business is more likely to sustain itself.
Makes a lot more sense
in the early days. Yeah, if you have a building, if you have a brick that you're buying in a building.
Don't borrow money on something that's going to be a big risk. Borrow money on something that's pretty solid.
Well, or more importantly, you have that brick that's going to last you 40 years. Why should you have to pay for it in 15?
Ah, okay. Well,
okay?
That makes sense.
So you're tracking the financing a little more closely to the life of the asset, which is what you want to do generally in structuring financing anyway. So it does allow the borrower to get into the business to get in. And the idea, once again, at the end is give them an affordable way to purchase this, give them an opportunity to retain working capital in the business, allow the business to grow, create jobs, opportunities, support economic development, and all those things that flow from a well-capitalized, growing business. So that's the prospect. Fantastic.
A good thing.
Fantastic program.
Touch on one other thing before we get close to wrapping up. We're almost out of time, but I know there's a zone program as well.
Right. One of the companies that we have is an Empire Zones loan program. A few years ago, we purchased zone credits, and it's a fairly involved procedure, so I won't bore them with it, but we purchased zone credits, tax credits from a number of Empire Zones across the state. We did that with money that we raised from investors. Once again, banks and insurance companies across New York State who were willing to ante up for economic development. We raised $29 million. And that $29 million we now lend out in increments of no greater than $300,000 per project. And
so relatively small.
Relatively small, $50,000 minimum, no greater than $300,000. And those are loans made to zone certified businesses across New York State. The interest rate is prime minus 2%. Which is fixed at the date of that, and it's a very affordable interest rate. We may be having to change that shortly because we're running out of money. We're going to have to go out and now borrow.
It's a very popular program.
It's a very effective, but now we're going to have to go out into the market and borrow money.
So that'll
we'll run out of our equity. It'll raise the price of it, not significantly, but it will also. The important part is that it's very affordable. That program looks to take subordinate liens and really support the growth of businesses in Empire Zones across New York State. And Empire Zones generally are urban areas that need a little bit of a shot in the arm. They need some inducements for people to locate and maintain their businesses there.
Does anyone actually move into an Empire Zone, or would it be more staying there and developing?
Well, at the risk of venturing down a very politically charged path, I think the idea in the Empire Zones was to bring jobs to the Empire Zones. whether that was a substantial expansion of existing businesses.
Well, at least
it's
they
certainly
stay
one
there.
way to do that, but the more anticipated ways that business would relocate into Empire Zones or expand and maybe open a second location in an Empire Zone, that would create opportunity. It was designed to be a program that created opportunity in opportunities to restore. I wouldn't use the word blighted areas, but areas that had urban areas that
And they've been targeted, that they need a little help.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that had a difficult row to hoe,
Right.
in past years, and they were trying to give them sort of a helping hand back into to take a more vital role in the urban areas that they were located in.
The whole program seems to be a wonderful example that businesses also can have a real social conscience. I know that it's also business, but that it can work together.
Oh, it's, we've had, my job, I have a great job. I mean, it's great. You have people who are interested in economic development, people who are interested in helping everyone do better. Certainly a rising tide floats all ships, but, we see a lot of activity, whether it's from our lending partners or economic development partners across the state, that are just truly interested in doing the right thing for a particular business and a particular person. Whether it says, we can give you the loan, you may want it this way, but this is the way you need to have it because, take our word for it, this is the best way for you to get it. Or, this is not, I know you're willing to bet your house and your future and quit your job and bet your IRA and mortgage your house to the hilt to get the capital to do this. But, that's a foolish thing for you to do and you need to rethink that. So it's a tremendously rewarding job. It's a collection of partners that are very much committed to making good things happen in New York.
It's a wonderful model for other areas, perhaps.
We would hope. Yeah, we're very proud of what we do. We're very proud of our whole consortium and the team we've put together across the state. We have a great collection of people at NYBDC, that's for sure.
Well, I want to thank you very much for coming and talking about your organization, and it was really interesting.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I want to thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show and that you watch again next time. Have a great day.
Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.